This is Lynn Fraser with the Kiloby Center for Recovery for the Radical Recovery Summit 2019. And Scott Kiloby and I today are going to talk about the body. Scott is the director and founder of the Kiloby Center for Recovery in California. He's a certified addiction specialist counselor in California. He's a non-dual teacher and an author. And we're going to talk about how addiction relates to the body and how it is that we're living through our bodies and how we can work with all of the different issues that happen around being in our bodies, being in pain, having trauma in our bodies, and then how do we work with that?
You know, that's what we're talking about, Lynn, and what's coming up for me is that I've had this conversation before, and sometimes there's like when I start to talk about it or we start to talk about it, if it's not somebody's experience to be aware in their inner body, it's like they have trouble hearing the conversation actually. This is quite common, and I hear it like when you start talking a language that isn't familiar. So I would just say that if you're listening and you're resonating, that means you're really kind of ready for it all. But if you find yourself sort of like feeling disconnected from the conversation or not hearing it or fogging out a little bit, it could be that it's just because it's like your experience hasn't taken you into the body. So don't be discouraged I have to say that because I often do have this conversation and I see a sort of a stare or a glare come over people's faces if they haven't experienced it.
Mm-hmm. So let's start with the link with trauma and addiction, and in particular, how trauma disconnects us and takes us out of our body. What do you see around that?
You know, I always want to stick to my own experience, which immediately I remember being in 6th grade, again, being bullied and feeling like I had to hide from the bully to be safe. Shortly after that, I remember being in a safe and comfortable place and hiding with 2 friends that weren't bullies, and it was the first time I picked up chewing tobacco. So the link is so perfectly set in stone in my own story. I don't even have to get all clinical on you, really. I can just tell you. I first noticed it in my own life was this direct connection between the feeling of comfort and safety and connection that I was receiving from the tobacco that I had lost or could not find in my social relationships as the bullies, people around me were bullying me. So there was a direct connection. And I think it's just different for everybody. There's a connection for many people, but what the connection is specifically has to do with the content of your own experience in your life. So that's just my experience. So what I see it in different flavors in different people's lives. So different traumatic events or things that happen, and then different substances or activities that got linked up to those events. You know, take that thing or use that thing to feel better if this emotion comes back up. So if that makes sense, it's like it's so widespread, but it's different for everybody, right?
Mm-hmm. And for me, when I was 12 years old, I had an experience where I was being publicly shamed. I had an experience with a guy, and he said that I'd had sex with him. And it went from there around the whole school, and I was living in a small town, and I was publicly shamed as the bad girl, one with a reputation. And shame in our bodies feels so threatening. And for me, especially at that age, peer support becomes critical as you're getting into your teen years. And our sexual identity and our sexual expression is so integral to who we are. And to be shamed for that, and I know that was part of what the bullying was for you too, was around your sexual identity.
Totally. And thank you for starting with a really vulnerable point, because I remember being a kid and feeling like flavors of shame, which I would call more like humiliation.
Right. Mm-hmm.
You know, it was humiliating. It was a very, and yeah, either shame or humiliation are very challenging in the body because it feels like a fight or flight.
Mm-hmm.
Can't be with this. Yeah. So thank you for bringing it down to that.
Mm-hmm. And I find that most of us will do almost anything to get away from that experience, to get away from feeling that. So for me, it started with ice cream when I was 12. And if I could get my hands on drugs or alcohol, I would. But the ice cream was the reliable thing. So, one of the things that happened to me when I was doing this living inquiries work several years ago was I had this experience of real sharp pain in my heart center. and it lasted for about 3 minutes. And I was in a session at the time. I was being facilitated. And at the end of that 3 minutes, I just started laughing and I went, I've avoided that 3 minutes for 50 years. You know? And wow. And it was just 3 minutes and then it was gone.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, so many stories like that. And I also remember just dealing with various addictions as they through the mindfulness and the inquiry that we do.
Mm-hmm.
I remember very, very distinctly, like having just little thoughts that around, for example, chewing tobacco or doing something, where it felt like that the reason that I was chewing it again was simply to avoid some feeling, right?
Right.
But I don't know what the feeling was exactly. The mind just had a sense that there's something that I don't want to feel. And then every time I would sort of just continue to inquire into it and the thought of the thing fell away, what I found out was that the energy, like you, wasn't nearly as bad as like my mind was. It was more like heat and anxiety, but it was just sort of, once I got really quiet with it, it just moved through, you know. But the mind does tell us that those things are unbearably scary.
Mm-hmm. And so one of the things in the living inquiries that you work with and that you brought up right in the beginning of the inquiries was the Velcro effect. So there are thoughts, memories, associations that are linked to energy and sensations in the body. And so when we're paying attention to the body, those memories will come up. If we're paying attention to something that's being stored there because it was too overpowering at the time, we couldn't deal with it at the time. So that's part of what we're avoiding.
Yes, and that came up just from being around spiritual teachers who were talking about being in the body, and then also coming down to feel emotions or sensations without putting thoughts on them, which was a revolutionary idea for me. And so as I started to do that, I started to just call it the Velcro effect, because what I saw is that it's like almost never did one come without the other. So it would be very rare for me to have thoughts without something registering in the body at the same time. So there was this Velcro or sticky connection between mind and body. Or it'd be rare for me to feel something without having some viewpoint or opinion or story there in the mind. So once I saw that they almost always come together, I felt like I needed to name it for myself and for other people. And that, therefore, it helps you to spot it. You know, you can then trust your body when you're experiencing anything, sort of thoughts or upset or suffering or trigger or craving. You can trust that there's something going on in the body at the same time. That's right.
Mm-hmm. So if the reason that we're not in our bodies is that we're trying to avoid shame or feeling overwhelmed or something like that, if that's why we're trying to avoid it, then we're going to be scared to be tuned into our body.
Yes, right. So, you know, I'm closing my eyes because I want to feel what you're saying, but because I know how, you know, the ego works. It says that these things are too much, but you know, as you know, Lynn, as you start to recognize the awareness that's prior to all that, like it's towards like the foundation to all of that, and you start, well, I'm looking from it now, there's actually not anything really scary about energy, emotion, or sensation that arises in that awareness, because the awareness is just pure awareness. It's not thinking those scary thoughts about what's registering in the body, right? So I like to just dispel it from the get-go, like that from our true nature, none of these things are overwhelming or too intense, but to ego they are. And that's what we need to really point out here, that to the story of the self that's trying to protect itself and survive, psychologically survive, not just physically, then to that entity, that false entity, the body is a scary place that we don't want to go to. But we need to just dispel this. We need to like call it out, say what it is, so that we don't get fooled into believing that it really is that scary to feel this stuff. Because you and I both know that it's not. It's not. Because 3 minutes on yours, right? I said, and then I've had the same experience where like I didn't want to feel anger, but once I allowed it, it took maybe 30 seconds to a minute before it started to transmute to something else,
Right.
and eventually to pleasure or bliss. So, right.
So let's talk about awareness, because not everybody is going to be able to go into awareness. So what do you mean by that, and how could somebody do that?
Right. So that's what mindfulness and non-dual awareness and inquiry are all about. And no, we don't know that we don't understand this over here in the West very well. We're starting to. In the East, they know that our identity, our whole story, the content of our life and all of its meaning and interpretation is contained in a set of thoughts right here that are appearing to our awareness every day. So we're in those thoughts, okay? That's something that everybody can relate to that listens to me, because that's the East state, where you're literally identified and consulting this thought stream of words and pictures constantly. So in that case, you wouldn't know awareness because you only know your thinking, right? So that's where everybody, or most people who are listening, are going to be relating to me. Goes to be like, yeah, my mind goes all day long. You're going to say that, they know. What I'm saying to you, even though it's maybe not your experience, is that there's something prior to that which can turn and so there's an awareness within us that is not one of these thoughts. It's actually aware of these thoughts. You can turn towards it and actually begin to look at words that appear in awareness and pictures, and you start to see your thoughts. So that's different than being in the ego state. And you have to kind of trust, if you haven't had the experience, you just kind of have to trust me that awareness is there, and then kind of feel into it through meditation, inquiry, or some practice until it becomes your own experience.
Well, and that's one of the things, I've been meditating a long time when I came across the living inquiries. And one of the things I love about the inquiries is that it's very specific. So thoughts are words that we either can see like they're written out, or we can hear them. And they're pictures, which are either still pictures or video clips. Yeah. And then you have all of these tools that we can, put an image into a frame or see it like it's on a screen, or then we tap on them and do these different things. And all of those are to help us to recognize that we're looking at or we're experiencing thought.
Yeah, and by the way, that was a brilliant description of it. Probably one of the best I've heard, and yet still I would say to anybody listening, you have to experience to know what we mean. But here's one way, because I use my hand sometimes, is like, if you can just hear me intellectually, it's like, I'm going to explain what Lynn just said, which is that in any given moment, if you're experiencing anything kind of craving or trigger, if you look, there are words and pictures there. Those are your thoughts. They're in the form of words or pictures and/or pictures. And there's some energy there in the body, whether it's emotion or sensation. So that's always going on when you're triggered or when you're craving something, or and not knowing that is amazing. Like, how do you go through life not knowing that that's what your experience is? Because you can get fooled into thinking that all of your thoughts are true, or that people really are awful, or that this life really is, you can start to believe whatever that is without knowing that. I'm so glad that somebody told me that, hey, guess what? There's an awareness here, and in that awareness, you're just believing everything that so that's all that's going on. You're just believing it. And there's a way to no longer believe it and to be awake and aware in the present moment rather than in all those stories. So yeah. So through our process, it's hard to explain, isn't it? But through our process, we bring these words and pictures up sort of one at a time, and we observe them from awareness, and then as they dissolve, then we take people into the body to feel what's there without those words and pictures in there. And that's what I think the beauty of going into inquiry with our work, because it really does bring you back to body sensation or emotion every time, in the middle of it, like over and over, till you just get accustomed to being aware down here,
Mm-hmm. Well, and maybe we could talk a little bit too about how there's this feeling in a lot of spiritual work that the body doesn't really count. And I'm seeing a lot of difference in that over the last, in therapy as well. Psychotherapy used to be talk therapy, and now a lot of it is more somatic. It's more in the body. So why do we need to be in our body? You've spoken about head awakenings and then all of the work that still has to happen in our body.
Yeah. Why do we have to do that work? Well, the thing about it is, we once thought the earth was flat too, right? And so when I think of therapies that have rejecting the body, I think of the flat earth idea, because it's like at some point we have to acknowledge what our actual experience is. Rather than just being intellectual or clinical or academic, we have to actually trust our own experience. So academia or clinicians can say, or scientists can say it's all mind or whatever. But we know in our actual experience that when we're triggered, we feel it here, down here. See, or when we're afraid, we feel it right there, or whatever it is. So we know that, and so we can trust that because that is our experience. And so if that's our experience, we have to, anyone who says it's not our experience, that body is not a big part of our experience, that feelings and sensations are not a big part of what shapes our world and our experience, we can't trust it after a while. We can't trust people who defy what our actual experience is. We have to trust that our body is part of this. And that's where I think you get out of the intellectualization of all this, and you get into the practice of it, and you come to discover for yourself that the body is a big part of this, right? So for the players, I just say, look, that's fine. You can continue to say that somehow the mind and the body are completely disconnected, or the body is irrelevant. You can completely continue to say that, but in the end, I think that it's going to bear fruit. It's going to show us, something's going to show us in the end what I'm saying, which is that you can't actually divorce one half of your experience in therapy.
Right.
You can't.
It doesn't really work. And that's why a lot of times people will have maybe years and decades of therapy and still have this energy in their body that they're scared to feel. And so what I find with this work, any kind of embodied work, is that we get to be so familiar with it and we're not scared of it anymore.
Yeah.
But, we start with this kind of dread of, oh my God, what if I actually went into my body and felt all that? And, all of the powerlessness and helplessness of when we were children and the disconnect. And we have such good reasons for disconnecting. And then now we're connecting back and it's like, I don't know if this is going to work.
Oh, gosh, so brilliant the way you just said that. Can you hold that thought? Because I want to also say that's a really good, what you just said about being a child and reconnecting. But I also want to say, it's just a caveat to everybody out there. If you're out there and you've been to therapy or anything where a therapist or someone didn't take you into the body, you can pretty much trust that the therapist is not embodied.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's not a derogatory thing. It's just a way for you to be able to find what you need if you've got trauma out there, is that I can only take somebody as deep as I've gone, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you, Lynn, I feel your presence, I feel that. And I know that when you sit with clients that they feel that, which means that they know that you've gone to this place in the body. They can feel that, right?
Right.
And you're not coming at me so much with your... So I'm just saying there's a real value in finding people who've gone down this path, who have learned and embodied the principle that there's nothing to be afraid of down.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's because it's people like you who are showing other people that it's okay to reconnect. So now, which takes me back to your question, or if you could say it again, we learn to disconnect as children, right?
Mm-hmm. And so that disconnection is there for a reason. So yeah, let's go into that a little bit more.
It is. It really is. And you and I were talking about it earlier. And for me, it was survival. Had I not found a way to start using tobacco as a way to disconnect from the pain of the trauma,
Right.
I felt like I would have died. Like, I don't know what would have happened.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a necessary thing for me to disconnect from scary feelings and to hide in an addiction or 3 or 4. So I would just ask you the same question in your experience. I mean, what was it like for you?
Well, the same. And, I was just going to say too, when I was working with you at the Kiloby Center, one of the things that made that so I could go so deeply into healing this trauma was because you were just this steady presence. So I could say whatever it was that was coming up, and I never felt judged or shamed. I didn't feel like you were reacting. It wasn't blank. It was alive and present, but it was that safe energy. And that's what I think we pick up on even more than the words, is that when someone has done their own work, they're safe for themselves, they're safe for other people. And then, oftentimes people say, well, I feel like I should be able to do this on my own. And one of the things that I'll often just kind of point out is that it takes us a while, and we need that steadiness of somebody else there for a while. And then as the really intense stuff starts to come up and be resolved, we have more stability of our own. There's more space. It's just not very possible, I don't think, for us to do that on our own at the beginning. We need to have that anchor there of someone else who's also stable.
I think that in most cases, you're absolutely right. That almost everybody needs uh,
Yeah.
community or support. Almost everybody. There's a few cases I've seen where people were able to do it without a lot of support, but mostly, yeah. That's why we have the Kiloby Center. That's why you do what
Right.
you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to this rich topic of why we disconnect as kids, it's such a huge conversation. It's like, for one thing, we're taught to, in the sense that we live in a kind of like a cult in a way, in that in order to be a human and belong to the human cult, you have to actually disconnect from your body, because that's what we do as humans. You see, so from an early age, it's like I'm learning from mom, both because mom is modeling that behavior, and maybe she's even teaching it to me, that fear is not okay to just sit and feel, that anger is not appropriate or civil or okay to feel or express, that shame is overwhelming and unbearable and shouldn't be felt. So, see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a bigger issue than even that. It's that we're being trained to be super unconscious
Yeah.
bodies.
Well, and Gabor Mate talks about that a lot, about the effect of these events of being abused or neglected is that we disconnect from ourselves. And we have to survive. So if we fast forward now, one of the things that I find very powerful is to kind of go back and see, what do I feel about that, for me at that 12-year-old. Am I mad at her that she couldn't figure it out? Do I shame her? Or can I be kind with her and compassionate and just recognize the amount of suffering that was there, and that I didn't do something wrong. I didn't experience that because there's something bad about me. I just experienced it, and then I began to believe there was something bad.
Yeah, innocent. Very innocent.
Yeah.
Yeah. No blame. There's just no room for morality in this, I don't think.
Mm-hmm.
Room for blame or judgment or morality or anything. Because you certainly did not choose in any way. Not really. And neither did I. So, yeah, going back to those vulnerable parts is the answer. And I just remember, as I was feeling into what you were saying, prior to sixth grade, I felt like I was a kid who was feeling things and being creative and out there and, performing and having fun. And then the bullying happened and it just went like repression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you think about going back, that's what you really have to do, is you have to kind of, from awareness, you have to kind of get into that feeling of what that little child felt and to begin to dispel the belief system there that is keeping you suffering. I mean, you have to look at it and dispel it. And,
Mm-hmm.
and what you said is you have to feel it from, in a way, you have to feel it the way the child felt it. Because as we get to be adults, we get so smart, we rationalize ourselves out of our pain. Like we'll say, well, that was a long time ago, or I'm not that affected by it now, or whatever. But as you go in from awareness and you stop trying to use your mind there, you actually feel that you're still carrying it around, and it's impact present day. So it's really good. Yeah.
So coming back to what you just said, though, about you used to feel really alive and creative.
Yeah.
So there's the
I
reason.
feel that way now again. I feel that way again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is the reason why we need to do this work.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we're living this kind of half life of dread and fear, and maybe we have some things in our life that we're happy enough about, but we're not fully alive as long as all of that trauma and dread is in there. We're not aware of what's in our body. We get really involved in overthinking and catastrophic thinking. And so that's the argument for doing the work, is that we come alive again.
We come alive again, and I've got a friend, Dan, that I eat dinner with a lot. And I was telling him the other day, I'm a little over a month out of pretty major spine surgery.
Mm-hmm.
Just been like 8 months before that, I was in just really bad pain. And then and this is relevant to your question, I think, is, and then for the time since the surgery, I've had just enormous pain at times. Okay. Now, juxtaposition that with a body and a mind, this system that's been doing inquiry and awareness for 12, 13, 14 years or whatever. And in the last year and a half, I've done inquiry literally every day. Okay. So there's just been this lots of freedom. Like I'm just like I feel like I'm exactly what I want to be or who I want to be. And yet at the same time, I've got this pain right in the middle of it, like this.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very strange juxtaposition to have to work through all this stuff and feel so free. I feel like that little 9-year-old before he was bullied. That's how I feel now in my life.
Mm-hmm.
My relationships, everything. And then here's this pain right in the middle of it. It's
Right.
but it's actually healing and I think going away. But I just want to tell people like this is why you do the work, because you get back to that feeling that you're finally who you always were supposed to be, but somehow it got sidetracked because of the things that happened to you or the things that you believe, you know.
So one thing that comes up for me while I'm hearing that is a lot of people who have some kind of pain in their body feel like their body has betrayed them. Do you have that feeling at all?
You know, because we do so much inquiry again, almost every day for a year and a half, many times on the pain, we've hit every angle of it. That wasn't one of my stories, that my body had betrayed me. I don't feel it now, you say it. It feels like not a betrayal, but it feels like, you know, no matter how much the awakeness is recognized in our experience, it's like the body is still the body. It's a finite form. So it's a structural thing. So for whatever reason, it's not going to be here forever. It's a temporary thing. And so I just feel more like, you know, this is part of the aging process or lifestyle process and not a big story around it, because I know that if one has a lot of story around pain, it just makes the pain worse. So I've looked at a lot of that and I don't feel like there's a lot around that, but I certainly know other people have stories that can be examined around pain and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that I've experienced too is looking at my life as kind of this sequence of events. And, you know, the effect of shaming and bullying is that we really harden up and hunker down and try and get away from it. We often do a lot of things that aren't healthy for our bodies, whether it's drugs or alcohol or food or all of those things that we do, smoking, all of those other things. And so there's an effect of that in my body, certainly, you know, of the different years of a lot of that kind of behavior. And then I'll get kind of stabilized for a while and it'll get better again. And then something will come up and it will trigger it again. And so my body has a certain less resilience in some areas because of the years of that. And in some ways, what I see is people who go into numbing have less problems in their relationships. Like we have more internal problems, but we have less problems in our relationships because we're not lashing out all the time. Right? But some people I work with have the lashing out pattern. And so then we look at that and that's what informs our relationships and our lives. And we have these things, we have these patterns because we've needed them. And then here we are with the results of them. And sometimes it's just, you know, something that we just have to recognize and go, well, that's what it's like. That's what it is. This is the result of all of these years of avoiding this or something.
Brilliant. I mean, that is just what you just said. Because what I want to say is, and I don't know if we've said it yet, is that if we can start to look at addictions as just, instead of a moral thing, it's just like, this is how this person took care of themselves.
Yes.
Okay, that's all. That's just how that, and so therefore there's compassion. There's just no stigma. There's no, you did anything wrong, because it was all unconscious. You learned how to take care of it inwardly rather than lashing by medicating like I did. And, you know, just first of all, can we just start thinking of addiction, not just as a disease really, but as just like, can we just get over it now, basically? Can we get over it and leave people alone and recognize that most everybody with an addiction is not choosing that behavior.
Right.
Okay. And therefore, there's just no room anymore for judgment and shame and belittling. And of course, it's going to happen because we get afraid and anxious. But I want to say that first.
Mhm.
So you can just lay to rest the idea that the way that you dealt with it or that I dealt with it is somehow inherently wrong or bad.
Right.
But the same is true for those people who lash out instead of indulging in. Let's have great compassion for them because they're also not choosing that behavior. That's what you see in an authentic spiritual awakening, that they're not choosing the behavior either. They learn how to cope by lashing out. It can be a little bit more challenging when there's a lashing out, arguably, than it is,
Mm-hmm.
you know, internalizing like that. But yeah, and so once we acknowledge that this is just how we've been coping, and we get over the upset around that, okay, and then we can start asking, how do we heal? But if we get hung up on blaming and being really anxious around each other, we're not going to heal so much because we haven't accepted the fact of our reality yet. Like
Right.
our reality is that we have all learned how to cope in various ways, and that it's okay. That's the reality. And so we have to get into reality in a way before we can find that solution. Because if we're fighting the process, or if we're fighting the labels or the stories, if we're, it's just going to be hard for us to deal with it, except through acceptance is what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Of this entire thing. That's how we heal, I think.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
So that gets a lot more subtle, I find. And sometimes what I'll notice is when I had PTSD really strongly after I was assaulted, and that was in 2005. So it's, quite a long time ago now, 13 years. So right after it happened, I was really triggered for several months, and then it gradually got better. And I wasn't doing the living inquiries then, but I knew meditation and yoga, and I was doing a lot of relaxations and working with my breath and really healing my nervous system. And then things started to settle, and what triggered me for maybe something would happen, I would see something and it would trigger me into a state of fear again, and it would maybe take a couple of weeks to settle it down. And then it started to be a few days or a few hours, and then it gradually got so that it was just, I could see it and I went, oh, okay, that the rush of fear just went through my body, and then I could kind of settle again, so it didn't affect me unconsciously anymore. I could see it. Still, there was an effect on my body. And I would still notice that, well, right now, there's this feeling that I just don't want to be present here. And I know how to make that go away, right? I could just have some food of some kind, ice cream or something, right? And so it's just like, really, I've really been working with patience and accepting that there's still some of that in my system, that there's still something in me that's still going, you don't need to do a relaxation, you need some ice cream.
Oh,
you know
yeah.
and I just find that so interesting that it's so persistent.
I think it's good. This is we're on the topic of recovery, and part of the compassion is not only knowing that this is just how we've taken care of ourselves and that that's okay, but also as it continues, instead of thinking it as a bad thing, think of it as an opportunity. And so we can just stop punishing ourselves. That's what I'm trying to get people to see through inquiry, is that can you start from a place of presence and acceptance and just look at any shame that's coming up over still doing that kind of thing, or look at the stories that are driving that behavior. It's what we do at the Kiloby Centers, and we say that this behavior of needing to medicate rather than deal with is not only a coping strategy, but it's an opportunity. See,
Mm-hmm.
because in the moment that we decide to medicate something, there's something driving. It's
Right.
not happening in a vacuum. That's the thing you got to understand. It's not happening in a vacuum. If I know it's not happening in a vacuum, then I know then that there's content around it. I know that there are reasons why my system is choosing the ice cream over the being with the feeling. And then usually that's in the stories. And so, with inquiry, we can pull up those stories. And it could be that I feel like on some fundamental level, I need the ice cream.
Mm-hmm.
It could be a feeling like I need like a utility, like without ice cream, I'll die, or I get ice. There are people who eat ice cream to get at other people. who don't want them to eat ice cream. There's a myriad of
Oh,
reasons,
yeah, there's a lot of control things. Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So, but until I know why I'm eating the ice cream, I don't have a shot. So it's an opportunity. So when I eat ice cream, therefore, at the Kiloby Center, instead of making that a bad thing or a relapse, we simply say that's what happened. Now, can we learn from it? Can we use it as an opportunity to find out what are the beliefs and the stories that are driving the behavior, and then we deconstruct, if we can. And,
Hmm.
and the other thing I want to say is, and it's just what you said, like to have ultimate compassion. Then, if you recognize that this recovery thing is definitely a long-term thing, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
it's it's not a quick fix. And if there's anybody who thinks that, just drop the thought. It's not true. It's a long-term unfolding. And if you can see it that way, then you know there's a trajectory, and you know then that even though your body is going to that, still in some cases it should be less than it was, much less.
Yes.
5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15. So it's just an encouragement to keep coming back, maybe to get even more nuanced, even to anybody who's at your place, to really look at what are the remaining stories that my system has
Hmm.
been carrying around.
And so then we're getting into this, the trauma response and why we have those mechanisms of protection in the first place, and how it can feel so threatening to really let them go completely. Because I mean, I know I don't ever need ice cream to manage my state anymore. It's just, I don't need it. And so why does that even still come up? Well, there's some kind of a residual feeling that, and I had this happen several years ago when I started thinking about drinking again. And I hadn't drank since I was in my 20s.
Well,
And
sugar.
well, it was sugar, but it was because the food wasn't working because I was aware. And so I couldn't really zone with the food. I couldn't zone out the way I used to. And so I'm thinking, well, maybe just in case I need it, I better have another strategy.
Yeah,
But we don't need a strategy. That's the whole point.
well, no, but the question,
Until we don't need it.
yes, your question is good though. Your
Yeah.
question is right. I mean, that's what the point of it is. The question is, and I sometimes joke around that nobody is sober just to get people's attention, so that I can explain that, like, even if you give up, like your main thing, like you said, the food's not working.
Right.
There's the body is naturally going to go to something under that, like a secondary thing,
Right.
take care of itself. Um, So that, just let that happen. Everybody's doing that. I mean, if you go into the 12-step rooms and you see all the people that are hovering around the coffee table
Yeah.
or cake or the getting approval or
Mm-hmm.
is still using. Okay. But all we can do on this trajectory is to examine the stories that have been connected to each one of these things, like you did. So you did it with the food and your system is, all you can really do is examine it as it comes up.
Right.
And then the unfolding over time, it does happen that you don't need those things as much. I mean, and I don't know whether in your situation it's more like the mind has a habit of it, because I remember that, it's like the mind would just think, well, I always do this at this time, so I
Right.
should. Or is it really a trauma response? Are you actually feeling a trauma or something in the body where you're going to that thing in order to medicate?
It could be, it's probably up and down a little bit. So as I feel that I've really healed the trauma. I don't feel driven by it anymore. I don't feel desperate. I don't feel any of those things anymore. And there's still, and working with people as well, our system our primitive brain and that whole survival system is always better be safe than sorry. So just in case there's some kind of a threat here, I'm going to keep my shoulders like this, or just in case. And so we look at that when we're healing that too, is we need to feel safe enough to let go a little bit, and then we feel a bit more safe, and then we let go a little bit more.
Yeah.
And these, a lot of the drivers that we don't feel quite safe enough yet.
Yeah, and so this is why at the Kiloby Center, we're changing some of the ways that we inquire. We're asking this question, like, so going back to tobacco, we'll ask the question or have the person say, I don't need to chew tobacco or drink alcohol. The reason they're having them say that is to pull up all of those unconscious
Right.
beliefs that are contributing to this. So when you did this with your body, that doesn't happen in a vacuum. That happens
Right.
with that of an interpretation in the mind. So
Yeah.
we get to that unconscious interpretation. We want to find out what unconsciously is the person believing that's creating the fight, flight, fight, flight, freeze in the body. So when
Mhm.
we say to you or to someone, I don't need to chew tobacco, what would happen is that those beliefs, maybe there's something like, well, I do to protect myself still.
Mhm.
Or
Mhm.
I do because I need to chew at them or drink at them because they want me to stop. So every time I do it, I get to prove a point to their presence. Or maybe there's a deficiency. See what I'm saying? It's like just continuing to examine whatever it is
Right.
under that. And I think it does get nuanced, Lynn. That's what I mean is we're really discovering that it's not just that where you're at is just happening in a vacuum. It's like
Right.
there's still something there, and you're just gonna have to keep working with it, you know.
Mhm. So so we're talking about being aware. So there's the mindfulness, the inquiry, and we're talking about being comfortable being in our own body and feeling what's there, feeling the sensations. People reach that tipping point where they're not afraid any longer to be in their own body and to feel
Yeah,
that. And then we're talking about seeing through the beliefs, because a lot of times when you're just talking about what are the beliefs that are still driving that, we might see the belief and then we try to figure it out in our mind,
oh yes.
right? And that's not the place to figure it out.
No, because it's in the body, it's held.
In the body.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I want to go back to personal experience because one of the beliefs that I had was I have to hide from people
Mm-hmm.
being bullied.
Right.
Right. So gosh, no, you can't figure that out in the mind. My God, get out of the mind because you're not going to figure it out there. Because what was happening for me is that for a long time I was using drugs and alcohol and sex and caffeine and porn, all this stuff, because it was hooked into the story I have to hide.
Right.
I had to examine that story very directly in order to sort of just deconstruct it, let it fall away over time before any of that could get impacted. I had to go to that story. The reason that I'm bringing this up is that I think we have to be really careful when we're helping people with trauma and things like this, because if people would have looked at me during that period of time, they wouldn't have been able to tell that what was really driving me was the story that I have to hide. And they might have done something like, oh, Scott, we just need to calm down your system, or you just have anxiety disorder, or it's like, no, that doesn't actually talk about, that's not what's really going on here.
Right.
What's going on here is that I believe that I have to fight in order to survive on this earth. That's
Right.
really going on.
That's a survival level threat.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's basic fact.
Yeah.
Okay, it's not anxiety disorder. I mean, that doesn't make
Yeah.
any sense. It's not. It's not any clinical thing. It's that this is the truth of my experience. I have to hide, and until I could get at that, I couldn't let go of the addictions that were connected to that belief.
Right. Right. And that knowing that you don't have to hide, that's from other people, but it's also from ourselves.
It's mostly from because I kept bringing up in the inquiry. I'd bring up the people that I have to hide from, and the places that I could use to hide, and the substances that I've used to hide, and the activities. And I had to just let it all there in awareness, and then eventually, as it dissolved, the thoughts dissolved, I had to get into the body and feel how the body had, like you said, it had done this for years,
Mm-hmm.
hiding, and it was holding on to shame and just energy and lots of stuff, really. And I had to get down there and just sort of just sit with it until it just, and in some ways, I'm still in the process because, as you said, it's like every now and then it'll rear its head again.
You have that opportunity then
Yeah.
to be aware and to work with it in that way. Yeah. And so then, we circle back again to as we dissolve all of this held trauma and these patterns, and we see through these beliefs, then what's left is not a lot of thought. There's no shaming. There's no tightness and contraction.
there's a lot of energy that gets freed up to do other things. That's the thing.
Right.
I've been telling people. It's like if you've been putting a lot of energy into, I'm a victim, or I have to hide, and all that energy gets withdrawn from that story, it's like that's freed up energy. So there's the creativity, there's more potential for creativity. There's more potential for harmony in relationships because you're just naturally more present.
Right.
You know, frankly.
It's hard to have an authentic relationship when you're dissociated, when you're not really there, or when you're being triggered by what they say or something like that. Yeah. So.
Oh, can I say one other thing, Lynn, real quick? The other thing that I think that happens on the back end of doing a lot of deep work like that we're talking about that involves inquiry and awareness is that what I call the somatic no. Okay, so the somatic no is the opposite of the old model of way of because in the old model it's like, especially the abstinence model, the idea is that somehow I've got to get in my mind that I can't use drugs and alcohol, that I'm going to be abstaining from drugs or alcohol or food or sex, and then somehow that's going to work everything out. What I found is that if that's fine if you want to make that your goal, but the point is that life has a way of being itself. So if it's time for you to relapse, it will happen. You know, it's just like, this is the reality that people do use again, even after a commitment to stay clean and sober. So what I think is, as you do more body work, you're actually feeling and releasing the stuff that's driving you to addictions. You're actually releasing it in the body. There's a somatic no. And here's how somatic, it's N-O, as in no. So it's like, before, it's like the Nancy Reagan, like, well, I'm just not going to drink because I have a problem with alcohol.
Right.
Or I'm not going to do heroin because I could never do heroin. I just lost my entire life savings and house and everything. Okay. And I'm not encouraging people to use. All that I'm saying is that when you do this deep work, when you focus on the pain and not the behavior, the pain, and you start to resolve that pain, the somatic no comes up. So the somatic no is the body saying no. It's saying no because it doesn't need it anymore. And one of the best examples that I have is like recent examples of after having the spine surgery. Let's go back before the spine surgery. You know, I went for months and months without ever asking my doctor for any painkillers, right? Months and months. And people, and my friends were saying, Scott, just get some frigging painkillers, you know.
So this was because of your addiction to them prior.
It was because it wasn't because I had a moral objection. It was that my body, believe it or not, because my body was saying, I'll let you know when the pain is bad enough, when you can go, I'll let you know, but it's not right now. And then we got to the point about 7 days before the surgery, and the body was like just a lot of pain. So I got on pain relievers, a really high level pain relievers. And then through the surgery and a few days after, I stayed on those pain relievers. But afterwards, the body again was saying no. It was saying, you're getting to a place where now you don't, it wasn't saying this in words. It was just trusting. It was like, now you can put this down. It was just simple. Even though that was my drug of choice.
Yeah.
It was just simple somatic no. That's what I really want to get people excited about in terms of body work and addiction, is that how you can trust the body. Just real quick, so I want to tell these stories because people don't tell these stories. You don't hear these stories. When I remember like putting tobacco down through the work, not through the old way where you say, I'm just not going to smoke.
Right.
Well, the way that I put it down was I'd literally be in a store and there's just all this variety of tobacco. And for tobacco users, it's like it's a smorgasbord. And my mind was saying, oh, how about that? And my body was saying no to every one of the brands. And it was like saying no except to one brand that it could tolerate. And then after a while, it started saying no to that. And then it just couldn't do that anymore. There was no real willpower. See?
Right.
And I
But you have to be listening to your body in order to hear that.
Yeah.
You have to be tuned into your body.
Totally. You have to actually be listening from the body and to the body.
From the body, yeah.
And so you're listening to the sensations, you're feeling the sensations and the energy. But it's almost like you're experiencing life from from there. Like, you're experiencing that question is, do I need something right now from there? So I just wanted to share that it's clunky, and it's not as clean as when you just abstain from everything by willpower. The stronger recovery, because it's the body. When the body says no, all bets are off.
Right.
The mind's not going to usurp the body ultimately. The body has the last say.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Yeah, I
The
didn't.
body has the last say in terms of using. So if someone's not done, to your point, the body will have the last say. It will take you back to the food.
Right. Yeah.
Right, if you need to.
Yeah.
But you see, it's actually a perfectly well-oiled machine in a way. It takes care of itself.
It is. And, we're not going to give up what we need to feel safe until we feel safe enough to give it up. Yeah. And when we don't need it anymore, it might take us a while to hear that, though. I mean, I remember when I quit drinking, it was because I couldn't stop vomiting. And, I was okay to vomit once or twice, but when it got to be 3 or 4 hours in a row, I'm going, okay, I give up. I can't do this anymore.
Yeah. So did you make a vow to quit at that point right there?
No, I just quit.
You just quit?
Because I couldn't. I would start and I would go, I can't face another night of puking all night. And it was so clear that I was doing something so harmful to my body. I couldn't do it anymore. And it was like 25 or something, and it's never been an issue for me since. Occasionally I'll have a drink, but it's not something I want. I don't have an issue with it.
There you go. And that's brilliant. And I think there's more of that with this work. I think that's like, there's just more of that to come the deeper we go with this work.
Well, and the thing about this work is that there's so much awareness. And when we can combine the awareness of being in our body with the kindness and compassion. So we're not shaming ourselves for having a driver of addiction. We're not shaming ourselves for behavior. We're just looking at how can we heal the pain.
So true. And I don't want to get too experiential here, but for those who start to really do these presence practices or awareness or mindfulness, the thing that is so noticeable for me is that when you're really tuned into the space of now, the stillness, like it's so gentle, it's so non-violent, it's so restful. And here we are doing all these very violent things to ourselves to try to get things to go away. But as we rest in and as the stillness, like there's just a really gentle thing. And that's what I want everybody to know. If you've never even tasted like awareness, to know what I'm talking about. If you're trying to figure all this out with your mind, like come give the awareness a try, because
right,
passion and love and acceptance, that it's in there.
Yeah, naturally there. Yeah. I have a lot of people that I work with that have that kind of inner critic who just always yapping at them like, oh, you're this, you're that, you're all of that. And I find that it's, well, I'd like to know what you say about that. How do you help someone with that really harsh inner voice?
I don't have it anymore.
And I don't either. It's great.
I know you don't.
Yeah.
And so the reason I say that is because I just had a conversation last week with somebody around this. And the only thing that I can tell is that as long as we identify with that deficiency story, first of all, because which is such a central part of our work, to understand that we're all identified with a central, at least one identity of deficiency, like I'm not good enough, or I'm unlovable, or I'm not supported, not accepted, not something. As long as we have that, how are you going to have a mind that is not judging you or trying to make you be something other than you want? It's almost like you have to, I don't know how else to deal with it. You have to inquire into that identity, because that's the thing that you're hearing every day.
Mm-hmm.
You're hearing the voice of that identity tell you things about yourself.
Right. And as long as that identity is intact, then you're going to hear that voice.
Right. I mean, people would say there's, I've heard, there's the ego, and then above that, there's the super ego or whatever. I mean, there's some, you can see it that way, certainly. But my point is that it really is that identity that is behind all of that.
Right.
Yeah. Because, you know, as you sit here with a quiet mind,
Right.
all it means is that there's no thought coming up to reference self.
Right.
There's no thought beating you up either. That's,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then what tends to come up then is just the excitement of life, or what you're interested in, or
yeah.
joy, or that satisfaction, that quiet. There's so much more that then those voices tend to be quieter. We can't really tune into them when that clamor is going on in the mind.
Yeah, it's really good to know. I did not know that about, I mean, I had a hunch that you don't really have much of that identity. It's really good for you to share that with me and for me to hear that. Because I think we can really, both of us, then speak to this from a different place, because I think a large majority of the pain that people are dealing with is because they're still identified with some version of a deficiency story.
Yeah.
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 So it's good, I think, for people to hear that you can actually move through it and beyond it. And,
Right. I think that's really important for people to know.
yeah.
And, you know, one of the things that I work with a lot of people who had a lot of violence in their childhood, and they have a really deep fear that they're not going to be okay because that was the truth. And so then they have some deficiency story that's very strong because it's based on, I'm in a situation where I don't know if I'm going to survive this. And I can't stand that. I mean, that feeling is so horrible, just feeling there's nothing I can do to make this different. So then they take that on themselves.
Yeah.
Like, well, maybe if I was this or that, or so people take on the blame. And so then they have this fear that's really associated with that deficiency story. A lot of times when people are afraid, if there's abuse or violence in their home, they grow up with fear for their life. And then they have a deficiency story around that somehow that's their fault, they're to blame. And the amount of fear and terror really makes the deficiency story hard to let go.
Oh my God. You such good questions, and like, it can so much to what you do this work. Here's the only thing, it's such a topic here at the Kiloby Center too, that here's what was coming up as I listened to you, is that when we have experience to back up our belief systems, it makes it feel like our belief systems are absolutely true. So, for example, if I feel unsafe, but then I look back and think, well, yeah, my dad used to hit me, right? There's a utility behind my belief system. There's an experience that I can say, I have a reason for this. It's not just a crazy thing, right?
Yeah.
But in the end, I say it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because the point being is that, yeah, we learned these things and we learned how to cope, and we learned that dads can be scary, and we learned these stories of deficiency as a way to survive. However, we may not need those things anymore.
Right.
Once we see what they are, once we deal with the pain, and once we start connecting with people who don't do that to us anymore, right? Being with good people who are not going, who are conscious and who are not going to do that.
Yeah.
And then we can, yeah.
Yeah, we really have a lot more power as an adult to get away from people who are hurting us.
Yeah.
And it's not at all easy. And it's certainly possible. Yeah.
But boundary setting is a bedfellow of this work to me. Because as you said, it's like our system will only let us work on something if it's sort of ready for that. And, and it also will not, if we're paying attention and we're doing this work, it won't let us continue in a relationship that's going to harm us. If we're really tuning into the inquiry, we're going to be bound around various places with people that we have to. So as a way to protect ourselves until we're ready to deal with the issues that we're laying a boundary down on. That's what I mean. I think I'm trying to understand who's going to be hearing this interview. And, you know, I know people that are interested in the recovery thing are going to hear this. And I think we've talked a lot about addiction. You know, just the obvious thing that if I am present more to my feelings, I'm going to reach out less. I mean, that's a simple principle. 2 + 2 is 4. But there's a lot of people maybe out there that are going to hear this and are going to wonder, how does this apply to me? And that we could probably talk about that just how it just is helpful in everyday life, even if you're not in recovery, or even if you don't have, well, and I think it was helpful for me when I first started the practice was because what I found out is I couldn't work a lot of things out in my head. Like I would start to feel something, and then my mind would try to get in there and figure it out, but it actually didn't resolve a lot, and I was carrying around a lot of unresolved feelings. So
Right.
I started to just be present to those feelings, taking the thoughts away. It's like things just started to get resolved.
Well, and some of the tools that you've developed at the center, are things like noticing the energy in the body and what are the qualities or the attributes of it. Yeah, and I guess partly for me too, it would be that there's so much more joy in living when we're in our bodies, and that it's absolutely important to not push ourselves into being more in our body than we're ready to be in our body, and to really honor the pace that it feels safe to go at. But that even given that, though, even though somebody might be in a panic and have a hard time focusing in on the breath or something, that we really do need to work with our nervous system. And that's why we do these practices of inquiry and natural rest, and to do it over and over and over and over, so that we build up that resilience in the body, we become steadier and more stable, and that's what enables us to then be in our body and to look from awareness, that when we're really panicked and we're feeling really desperate that we need to get away from something, it's really hard to have the ability to stay with it.
It is, and it just reminds me of why we have the Kiloby Center, though, and I want to talk about the online stuff too, because often people get to the Kiloby Center, maybe for addiction, maybe for something else, but I think they have it in their mind that, hey, I'm going to do a 30-day program here. It's not a 30-day program. It's as long as you can stay.
Mm-hmm.
But in their mind, they'll say 30-day because they just don't know what you just said. They don't understand that like our bodies are regulating themselves and our minds are protecting us from having to feel things before we're ready. So the process of becoming embodied and starting to feel things is in some cases a gradual process.
It is.
And being held, sometimes your hands are being held the whole time, and it can go on for a long time. And so that's a really good message to send out today, because I think in our world we have this sort of fix-it mentality, or the cult, sort of like, I want to go to the doctor and get a pill. I want to go to do this, so it's going to wipe away that. But the more mature way of looking at it is that you're retraining yourself to relate to your experience differently, and that takes time.
Yes, it does.
But it's a much deeper transformation than any of the Band-Aid fixes out there.
Right? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So if what's driving the anger is some kind of trauma, and if what's driving reaching for some kind of a substance is some kind of pain, I love you talked about the new method of really working with the drivers. What is it that's pushing that? And why is it that we can't be comfortable in our own skin? And to really work with that.
It's so interesting. So you have the Kiloby Center, we say, again, along the lines of the body keeping the score, we say the behavior of acting out with heroin or ingesting something or drinking something is at the tip of the iceberg. So it's just the symptomology surface layer.
Yeah.
As we get below the iceberg, we find that in the body there's being held trauma and shame and other emotions that haven't been resolved. So we're taking people into those emotions, into those belief systems, kind of clearing them, having them rest with them, and then they get sort of clearer and clearer around them. And then then the idea is then that they naturally stop going to the addictions or to the other things up here.
Right. Yeah.
So I got your question, but I know I wanted to say that so that people understood what the drivers are. Is that what you were asking, what the drivers are?
Yeah, basically, yeah. Yeah.
The drivers are all the somatically held stuff, like I said, like the trauma that people tend to hang down here, or the shame as a heavy body thing, or deficiency worries, or external pressure, which is everybody else wants me to stop using, but that makes me want to use more. And any other thing that tends to drive the body. back and forth, but the back and forth to the substance or the activity.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But the good news is, as you deal with it, there's just less going back and forth.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, and then you have that stability and that quiet and that confidence and access to what's here. Because when the mind is going 100 miles an hour, we don't really live in our bodies, and what a shame that is.
It is.
Yeah.
And Lynn, I want to say one more thing, because this recent injury to the spine has given me a lot of insight around this. For me, the physical pain has been a driver to find relief. Natural, right? And so I can literally see if I can explain this right. I can literally see how I've done a lot of work on the drivers of trauma and shame and the deficiency stories. Feel those drivers when it's time to medicate the physical pain. Feel the driver. So what I feel is the physical pain, but it's a driver to medicate, right? Find something to medicate it. Just interesting, because when the pain subsides, as I said, then the driver towards the behavior of medicating subsides.
Right.
And
Yeah.
there isn't a lot of trauma or shame in the body to pick up the game and keep it going.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? Which is what I'm trying to tell people, is like, it's so much about the body. It's like, if you, like you say, if we can feel comfortable and quiet and calm and awake to, if we feel restful in the body, if we feel okay in the body, our lives are going to be sort of like, they're going to feel like they're okay and at rest. But if our bodies are noisy or uncomfortable, our life is going to be in unrest and chaos and seeking. So it's just so much about the body. I mean,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the wonderful thing about that too is that, we have all of these things we've learned. We've learned codeficiency or core deficiency beliefs. We've learned that we're not safe and we need to hide from people. We've learned we can't trust people. We've learned all of these things. And we have those experiences, and then our survival system takes over, and it's like, well, we can't forget that lesson, because then we'll be in danger again. And then we have, as we unpack those and see through those things, it's not like we are foolish about our own safety or something, but we are always overreacting. If the primitive brain is running the show, it's always overreacting. And so then we come back to what we know, because all of that other stuff just starts to dissolve, and then we're just left with what we know, what our heart says, the quiet, the awareness. And what a beautiful, even as a destination, I know it's not exactly a destination, but what a beautiful experience to have, that really makes all of that worthwhile. All of that hard work of turning towards the pain and healing it. And
turning towards the pain and healing it, and then living more in the stillness, peace of the present moment, where you see that all of the reactivity that we were doing isn't necessary anymore.
Right.
Like,
It's
not even like we're making a decision not to do it anymore. It's just like, it just isn't necessary. And at the same time, there's like a compassion for it. It's like, fine. And if I see it in other people, it's fine, because I know what's happening now. I know that they can't help it either, that it's a script in them. And, so it just ends in a whole bunch of love and compassion for this whole human experience, really.
Mm-hmm. Which is a pretty tough experience. It's hard to be a human being.
It is.
Well, I hope people have found this encouraging. And, one of the things that I really know, that healing is possible. Healing is possible for every single person that's willing to work in this way, and that's ready to, and that can open up to this.
It's absolutely possible. And I think, if anything, part of the job of all of us is to simply stay in the process of it,
Mm-hmm.
because it's so easy, just as a last thing, it's so easy to start working on the body in this way, and then to get sidetracked as we, but just sort of staying with the process. It certainly is like very rewarding, but it can be challenging to stick with it too.
Mm-hmm. Not as challenging as being in an addiction, in an active addiction, though.
Truly.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Is there any last kind of thoughts that you might want to share?
No, I mean, I mean, if this conversation resonated with you out there, there's certainly we have facilitators online. Go to livinginquiries.com if you need more support. We've got a treatment center in Palm Springs that does this kind of work. KilobyCenter.com. Lynn, I've been wanting to say this about you. For those of you who've been watching Lynn, I hope she doesn't edit this out. For a couple of years now, as a moderator for Radical Recovery, make no mistake that she's much more than a moderator. She has years of experience as a teacher, meditation, yoga, and inquiry. She's one of my certified facilitators. And frankly, if you haven't tried a session with her, you should. Especially if you're interested in my work, I just want people to know about Lynn. She's not just a moderator. She's a very skilled facilitator who can take people incredibly deep. So I just don't think you've gotten credit for that. And I want to make sure people know that about you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, for the first time in my life, this last several years, I feel absolutely in alignment with what I'm meant to be doing, and I just love this work.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Lynn. Great. My favorite topic.
Go to kilobicenter.com, Radical Recovery Summit, for access to the interviews. You can watch them free online, or you could purchase an all-access pass. kilobicenter.com.